No, I'm recording us as well. So
Okay.
this is brilliant. Okay, let me just see if my questions have synced with my iCloud app. Brilliant, they have. So, for the purposes, because I'm recording this for other people as well,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to introduce you. But tell me if I've got any of this wrong. So, Andrew, you've been a reporter at the BBC for nearly 20 years. Is that right?
Oh gosh. Yes, that would be about right. Yes, well done. Yeah.
And I work with Andrew on the PM programme on Radio 4, and so you're basically your stories range everywhere and anywhere, don't they? You've been all over the world. So you also work on BBC News Online and also TV stuff and docs. So it's
Yes.
not just radio.
Yeah, that's one of the great things about the BBC is we get opportunities to work in lots of other areas. There's a very good internal sort of attachment system, which is a bit like doing a job for a period of time. So most of the time people are based in one department, but often there are opportunities to work in other departments. I mean, I'm in radio, but working, say, in TV or working online and that kind of thing for periods of time. And then you can kind of come back to your home department, after you've done that. So lots of opportunities to get different sorts of experiences, different jobs.
And before you were at the BBC, you were at IRN. Is that right?
Yeah, yes, I worked at IRN, which is Independent Radio News, which is not really sure kind of how much of a feature they are these days because the commercial radio sector has been so sort of fragmented in terms of news delivery. But when I worked for them, they were part of ITN, Independent TV News, and so they had a sort of similar system where you could work on TV as well as radio at that particular time. But I worked for IRN for about 4 years, I think it was.
And before that, in Hong Kong.
Yes, yeah, I worked for a couple of newspapers and briefly a radio station in Hong Kong as well for about 4 years. And I've started my career many years ago, probably before you were even born.
I think you're flattering me.
I was thinking about the students, but I started anyway working in commercial radio. I worked at Piccadilly Radio in Manchester, which was my very first job. In Piccadilly, it became a couple of different radio stations. I think one of them is called Key 103 in Manchester now. But at the time that I worked for them, they were a big independent radio station with a very large newsroom providing news 24 hours a day. It was a good place to work, but as I say, the commercial radio sector has been utterly fragmented, and there aren't many jobs in news these days, I'm afraid. There.
And I'm going to we've talked through the High Street Abduction story, but I'm going to hand over to the students and get them to ask your questions in order of who submitted their questions first to be most fair. I'm going to ask one on behalf of Josh because Josh can't be here today, unfortunately. He's got a funeral. But as a news reporter, Josh says, how do you deal with the pace that news stories have the capability to change at?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, through my career, depending on the different sorts of jobs I've done, the pace can change enormously. Sometimes according to particular jobs you're doing. You know, if you in the BBC, if you work in a department called news gathering, their job is to produce all the news you see in the kind of news bulletins on the TV, on the radio, and online. And so that's the kind of breaking news, the stuff that's happening day in, day out, all the time. And with that sort of job, the pace can be absolutely frenetic. You know, it can be really very, very pressurized. You have very little time very often to get to grips with what the story is that you're actually covering. You do have to live on your wits to a large extent. You have to have very good kind of general knowledge about subjects, be a bit of a jack of all trades, and so, you know, that can be very pressurized, but at the same time, it can be really exciting too. I mean, I don't deny that it can be a huge kind of adrenaline buzz sometimes to turn stories around really quickly, to get them on air, to beat the opposition. and all those kind of things. But I think it is a bit of a young person's game, that sort of thing. I'm not sure that you can kind of keep that going for forever. And so, working as I do now on Radio 4, one of the beauties of the job and things I really enjoy is the fact that we have time to get to understand stories, what the real story is behind the headlines, and we have time to research things properly. We have time to go out and do interviews with people. We've got time to kind of produce what we hope is a crafted and worthwhile product at the end of the day. And there are still busy days, of course. So like anything, we produce daily news programs, so it can be pressurized. But I'm glad to say, as a reporter, most of the time I get a bit more time to look into things in more depth these days.
Tom, can I get you to come? Yeah. Otherwise, the mic won't pick up. So you have to. Tom's.
Mark, isn't it?
This is Andrew.
It's Andrew.
Yeah,
okay, that's embarrassing. Okay. Hi. What is
Hi.
the outrageous story you have ever had to investigate?
Most outrageous story. Outrageous is a good word. Well, I mean, outrageous. It's a good question. It's one of those things that I find very difficult to go back over, because you work on so many stories. Only certain ones kind of stick in the mind very often. I mean, if I think of outrageous, I mean, I've been in lots of very weird situations before. I remember doing a story about the funding of terrorist organizations, which took me very oddly to Paraguay in South America. This was some years ago, and an area of this country where a lot of people from the Middle East had settled, particularly from Lebanon. And so there was a lot of money that was being raised through commercial operations and through smuggling in this area that was being channeled to terrorist organizations in the Middle East. And so I was doing a documentary on this for Radio 4, and so I spent a bit of time working on this. And part of what we were doing was going out with the kind of financial police, effectively, who were raiding things like money laundering operations, often through money exchange businesses, where people would just get kind of offices on the street where you would go and change money, and often these were fronts for terrorist fundraising operations. And I remember going out with the police on one occasion where they raided one of these places, and sitting there in a room with just enormous piles of US dollars all over the place in this room, stacked high. I mean, I'd never seen so much money in my life. It was well into the millions of US dollars in cash, just lying around in this office on desks. It was just very bizarre. I'd never seen anything like this before in my life, and I thought that was quite outrageous.
That's wow. Beth, you're next.
So before you got the job you have today, you went to Hong Kong.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Why did you choose to go to Hong Kong, of all places?
It was just a place that really interested me. My first job, as I mentioned, was at Piccadilly Radio, and I had a very wily colleague who did this deal with British Airways, where we would do a kind of like a travel program, and British Airways would supply free flights to us to go wherever we wanted. And so he became known in the newsroom as the kind of as the travel agent, and people would say, "Oh, I think I could do a great program in such and such a place. Can you get me tickets to there?" And so he'd go to British Airways, and they would give him tickets to go to this particular place, and we produce a program on the radio, which was basically sponsored by British Airways. You could never do that in the BBC. Obviously, the BBC doesn't accept commercial sponsorship, but you can do it in the commercial sector. And so I fancied going to Hong Kong, quite honestly, and so I went to Hong Kong, and I did a program, and I just absolutely loved the place. It was just really exciting. very different from what I was used to. Fantastic sort of pace of life there, and I just thought within hours of arriving that this was a place I wanted to spend more time in, and so after a while I managed to get myself a job there, and that's what took me there.
That sounds like a brilliant podcast idea. Pitch it to British Airways and live out the rest of your career travelling around first class. I know you've got more questions, but I'll move on to Amber and then come back. So, Amber, what did you want to ask? Might have to shout because it's on my internal mic here. So.
Were you initially interested in working in radio, or did you have a different career path in mind?
Do you know, I've always been interested in radio. To be honest with you, it's always been my kind of first love, and there are various reasons for that. I think you get much more opportunity to tell stories properly on radio. With TV, unless you work on something like Panorama or maybe Newsnight, programs that devote more time to their stories, you almost inevitably get your stories crunched into about a minute and a half or so on the air. And that really isn't a very long time to kind of tell a story properly, I don't think. And so I've often been quite frustrated working in TV, partly because I never quite feel you get the opportunity to tell your story properly, partly because the logistics of television are much more complicated than radio. It involves lots more people. So you spend a lot of time when you should be kind of working on the story, actually working on the logistics of how to deliver the story. And so I think it impacts sometimes on the kind of storytelling. And so, while TV is kind of fun and great, and and I don't deny you can get a bit of a buzz about being on the TV, after a while I think that excitement factor dies, and I find it quite frustrating. What I love about radio is that you have much more freedom. You're not so real. I mean, the very basic thing is pictures to illustrate everything. Obviously, it works on sound, but you can tell a story much better because you're not reliant on the pictures that you're having to work with all the time. And I just think there are more radio programs that go into the news in much more depth than on radio than on TV. The nearest equivalent is online. I think the world of online improves all the time. The opportunities in online get greater and greater, and so the opportunities we have these days for doing in-depth stories on radio, but also online. By writing a piece for the BBC News website, sometimes writing much longer, more sustained pieces. I think that's really valuable. If you want to work as a journalist, I think you want to learn to tell your stories in the best way you possibly can. And so I still think radio, despite it being a very old medium, has got a lot going for it, and especially in the digital world, because these days everything we do on radio can be podcast. It can go online too, and so the opportunities I think are increasing for radio rather than decreasing.
And can I just ask a question? So this course is multi-platform news. How are you? We've seen your case study of the High Street Abduction, which you did online. How are you coping, and how much pressure are you coming under to visualise radio and to make everything that you do multi-platform? Is it something that you're under pressure to do, or is it something that you're doing because it adds to the story?
There is a certain amount of pressure. This is something which we've been doing very consciously in the BBC in radio, that is, in the BBC, in terms of visualising stories, I'd say for at least the last 5 years or so now. And so there is pressure to do that. But there is also a recognition that it doesn't always work. And so I think these days with most stories that you do, there's a kind of expectation that you would be also producing it for other platforms too. So at the very least with radio, you're doing a radio story and you'd be writing something for online. If the story's appropriate, if it works for TV too, you do it for all three. And so, there's a few stories I've done recently which seem obvious as really good picture stories. I mean, there was one I did a few months ago which was about hen harriers and about the persecution of hen harriers. And I got the opportunity to go and see a hen harrier chick having a satellite tag attached to its back by the RSE. And I just thought, visually, that's clearly a story that would work fantastically on TV. And so when you come across that kind of story as a radio reporter, you're thinking, great, well, it'll make a good radio story. It'll make a good online story too. The pictures will be good, but the TV pictures should be fantastic. So in those sorts of situations, you speak to your television colleagues, and you go off and do it for them too. So in that particular case, I did it for the 6 o'clock news on BBC One as well. And so there is a pressure all the time, I think, to be thinking about what the stories are. Will they work on other platforms? And if so, how to do that in a really effective way.
Anybody else? I know Beth's got more questions. Jazz, can you come and just get in screen just briefly?
What is the most dangerous situation you've ever been in?
I'm not. There are lots of people in the journalism world who are adrenaline junkies and just love war zones and things like that. I have to say, I'm not one of them.
I refuse to do hostile environments.
Yeah, actually, we all have to do a course called Hostile Environments, which you do it every 3 years, and it's basically a bunch of army types kind of roughing you up and teaching you how to do kind of medicine on battlefields and things like that. It's a kind of compulsory part of training because the BBC recognises that you could be sent to dangerous places at the drop of a hat, and so therefore you need to know how to conduct yourself in those sorts of situations. But I do everything I can to avoid that kind of thing, to be honest with you. So I've been to dodgy places. I'd say the most dangerous place I've been to is Somalia, and simply because at the time, and still to some extent, it was the closest you would ever come to a state of true anarchy, in the sense that there was no law enforcement, there are no police, there's no laws as such. When I was there, they couldn't even decide which side of the road to drive on, because that would have taken a kind of functioning government to say that we're going to drive on this side of the road or the other side of the road. So the result was that you just drive anywhere you like, and the person with the biggest gun gets to go through. And so that I felt was a very dangerous and threatening place. Because there's no rule of law, it meant that people could be killed at the drop of a hat. And in fact, we have had people within the BBC who have died in Somalia simply by being shot on the street for no particular reason. There was a producer that happened to a few years ago, very sadly. And it's the kind of place where you feel that could literally happen any time, because everybody has guns, and there is no rule of law. And so I'd say that's probably the most dangerous place that I've been to. But there are probably many far more dangerous places that other colleagues go to, which I try to avoid.
Anybody else got? Steve, I can see you. Yeah.
Yeah. So by being a reporter, what would you do to sort of persuade us to take up that sort of job?
I won't lie. I think you've got a really big challenge on your hands, because it's a very competitive profession to enter, and I think despite the fact that the opportunities online are so much greater than they ever were, it's really hard to make money. It's really hard to persuade someone to give you a kind of normal job these days. Like a staff job. I'm very lucky. I've got a staff job at the BBC. They pay my salary come what may. I suppose in theory you could be sacked if you were rubbish at it, but I'm not paid according to the numbers of stories I produce. I'd say increasingly these days, effectively you're freelance. You're paid by the stories that you produce, and so. That's really tough. It's really, really tough. And it's really tough getting started, because you've got to persuade someone that you can do a job that someone's going to pay you to do, when there are so many other people out there who who could probably do the job too. And so, I think as far as I know these days, you've got to be prepared to work for free very often. You've got to intern effectively. You've got to persuade someone that you can do the job without them paying you any money for it, so that in the hope that one day they are going to pay you money to do that job once you've proved to them that you can do it. And that's really tough. I mean, I think that's just outrageous that people should be expected to do that kind of thing, because unless you come from the kind of background where you can afford to do that, it's really, really tough. And so when I started out, the route in was to work for, in radio terms, was to work for local radio, was to find a local radio station somewhere and work for them, and then you kind of work your way up. Maybe you can still do that kind of thing. There are training courses that you can go on. Certainly the BBC operate training courses where you get fantastic training and you get paid. I mean, that would be wonderful, but obviously the competition for those kind of places is very high. I would say start small. Kind of prove you can do the job first, and then kind of work your way up. It's completely unrealistic to expect to get a job, working in national media right from the get-go. Unfortunately, it requires a lot of leg before you get to that stage.
Beth, you had more questions?
I was just wondering whether it's possible to get work experience for Radio 4.
I don't think so, unless you were doing it as part of the as part of the kind of proper BBC training schemes, and there are various training schemes around. You'll know more about those than I do probably. So yeah, people do work at Radio 4 as part of that for sure. When they're in that kind of training stage, but to kind of walk in off the street effectively and get unpaid work, well, I think that would happen very, very rarely, to be honest with you.
What I did was I got work experience via an indie that was working for the BBC. So I started out working on a doc for Radio 1. I mean, this was, I say started out, I was 7 years of a career, but I went and worked free for an indie, actually the one that Joe, we're speaking to my colleague Joe next week, down in London, doing a Radio 1 doc. And then Amanda got me some experience on the Jimmy Young programme then, phone-ins, but then I also worked for the independent production company that was making 5 Live Sunday Service. So I think that is still a realistic getting BBC experience.
Yeah, there are loads of independent production companies, and and the BBC has changed its commissioning process in recent years to mean that far more of the programmes that you watch and hear on the BBC are produced by independent production companies, not in-house in the BBC. And so the proportion of programmes that are produced by indies is much higher than it ever was, and is getting higher still. So so that's certainly a route in, because those companies tend to be smaller. They're more approachable in many ways. The BBC is a massive monolithic organisation. I mean, how on earth do you approach the BBC? It's huge. Independent production companies, are smaller scale, and it's easier to get to know people. And when you're working in smaller teams, you can make a mark. You can show someone that you're good and that you're effective, and you get noticed because you're part of a smaller team. So that's a good way of doing it.
I just want to bring it back to multi-platform news and just ask about, you're very interesting because you don't, this is a group of millennials who have like a 2-minute attention span and want 30-second articles, but you still advocate long-form journalism.
Yeah, I do. And from all the feedback we get from audiences, they absolutely love it. I mean, they really do appreciate being told about a story in depth. I mean, we've recently opened up a kind of new department within online. It's run by a former colleague of mine, one of our assistant editors, Lissa will know her, called Juliette Dwyer. And in-house, we call it slow news. This is an idea of a guy called James Harding, who's the director of news at the BBC. And the reason where the BBC is investing more money in what they call slow news is because we know that audiences really like to be told in depth. What's the story behind the story? The explainers. I mean, Brexit. I mean, how complicated is that? I mean, people want to understand what it's all about, and I think there's a massive appetite for in-depth news. And whenever we do stuff which is more in-depth, and that in the kidnapping story, which you've been looking at, that I did, they have an absolutely amazing response from the audience. People really appreciate, I think, the opportunity to read stuff in greater depth, to be told stuff on radio in greater depth, and in TV when the opportunities are there too. And so, I know people have shorter attention spans all the time, but there's, and if you're looking at something on Twitter, fine, that's completely appropriate. But I think often people want to understand more about stories, and they will seek out ways of learning more about those stories too. And so, I think there are still great opportunities to do that. And and I think the situation's improving, as I say, because of the numbers of outlets on digital, online these days than previously.
Does anybody else have another question? We've got space for one quick one, or we all?
Yeah. Well,
Steve?
so the question I asked about, how would you persuade someone to do it, to sort of like get into that job? What are the key benefits and their job satisfaction?
I mean, for me, I'd say the biggest benefit I like is creativity. It's having the opportunity to to be completely responsible. In radio, we tend to work solo a lot of the time. In TV, it's more of a collaborative effort. But I just like the opportunity of being creative, with sound or with stories or with the way that we tell stories. I've been doing it a long time now, and I think you learn all the time, and so I personally get a lot of satisfaction out of producing what I think is a kind of good product at the end of the day, and it's the reason, I think, why I've remained as a reporter. I mean, a lot of people kind of report for a while, and then they kind of go into the behind the mic or behind the camera side of things, go into the production side, and you kind of go up the kind of management layer effectively. You get more money that way. Managers get paid more than the sort of frontline people do. But I think you lose something personally in terms of the creativity of doing the job when you do that. I've never liked the idea of kind of being in a position where I send other people out to do the stories, because I'd rather be out there doing the stories myself, quite frankly. I just like meeting people, going places, finding out about people's lives. I think to be a successful journalist, you've got to be incredibly curious, and you've got to ask questions all the time, and you've just got to be interested in other people. You've got to be interested in what makes other people tick. And even after doing it for many, many years, this is what kind of excites me about the job, is just going out and having a kind of carte blanche, a license effectively to ask whatever question I like, to enter other people's lives, to kind of spend time with them and learn what makes them tick, and why they do what they do, why they live where they live, you've got a kind of license to do that, because you work for the BBC and you're going to do a story about it. People are prepared to kind of give you access to their lives in a way which is really quite unusual, I think. And that opportunity, and then the creativity of being able to tell that story, I just think is wonderful. And it's why, for me, I will always be a reporter. I will never do anything else.
Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We really appreciate it. Thanks ever so much. I hope the story that you're on goes well.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Great to see you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.